John Brooks here. Welcome back to another episode of the High Existence Podcast. Today I'm speaking to one of my favorite guests, Jules Evans. I've already spoken to Jules before. In that episode, we talked about his previous two books, Philosophy for Life and Other Dangerous Situations, and his second book, The Art of Losing Control. In that episode, we talked all about the benefits of Stoicism, but also some of the limits of a reason-based philosophical framework, and how topics like meditation, Eastern philosophy, and psychedelics might fill in the gaps if one wishes to experience a rich, integrated, and flourishing life. When I spoke to Jules about what he was working on next, he explained that he was in the process of co-editing a book with psychiatry expert Tim Reed, all about spiritual emergencies. The book is titled Breaking Open, Finding Your Way Through a Spiritual Emergency. I consider myself to be someone quite well versed in the spiritual space and psychedelic space, and I didn't really know that much about spiritual emergencies. And when Jules started elaborating on this topic, I knew that this was something that I wanted to learn more about. So when Jules finished the book, he sent me over a copy and I read it, and I was blown away by how important the book felt to me. It felt honestly like essential reading. I'll be recommending it to anyone interested in spiritual transformation, plant medicine, psychedelics, meditation. I'm not going to go into the definition of what a spiritual emergency is right now in the introduction, because we go over that at length in the episode, as well as tips for dealing with difficult spiritual experiences, the creative process behind the book Breaking Open, Jules' own spiritual emergency after his ayahuasca retreat. We discuss useful guidelines if you plan to attend psychedelic retreats yourself. We talk about psychosis versus spiritual emergencies, the value of psychedelic integration and psychotherapy, as well as spiritual elitism and the dark side of spirituality. But there's a lot more in here, and if you're anything like me, you will come away from this conversation thinking with different perspectives about things you thought you understood well. As you're listening to this, if you think there is anyone who could benefit from this, anyone who's going through a difficult time, or who is planning to go on a meditation or plant medicine retreat, I think it would be really great if you could pass it on or send them a link to Breaking Open for them to check it out. There's not a lot of information, unfortunately, out there on spiritual emergencies, and I do believe that this information can potentially save lives, and at the very least reduce a lot of unnecessary suffering. So without further ado, this is my conversation with Jules Evans. I have read most of the book Breaking Open, and I have to tell you that I really, really loved it. The stories in it are so vulnerable, and I'm used to reading kind of like non-fiction books, and this was like a real heart-opening experience for me, and I could see myself in nearly every story in some way, which was really,
brilliant
really
to
nice.
hear. Yeah, I also feel a lot of respect for the stories in it, for the other people's stories in it, and they're telling stories often that they've never told anyone. So there is, and I think there's a real honesty and vulnerability there, and I also admire their artistry to be able to kind of hold it still at arm's length a bit. Do you know what I mean? And kind of articulate it. So yeah, I'm really glad to hear that.
Yeah, it was kind of, there were elements of it that were very poetic and beautifully written, but also like I really felt like I was in the experience as well. Yeah, that was amazing. And I'm going to be recommending this book to my colleagues at High Existence and anyone who is in the spiritual space or the psychedelic space, because many of the ideas in the book were new to me, and especially the way that they were articulated. It's so different from like going on a Wikipedia page and just reading about spiritual emergencies. You actually get to see them evolve, the stories. So the first question I wanted to ask you was about how the book came about and how you selected the authors to write in the book.
Sure. So as you know, I spent a few years researching ecstatic experiences for my last book, The Art of Losing Control. And I was interested in how people go beyond their ordinary egos and have this kind of mystical type experience. How do they do that in modern culture? And I was aware that in modern Western culture, over the last kind of 300 years, there has been secular culture has rather pathologized ecstatic experiences, particularly secular psychiatry, and said that ecstatic, or you could call them mystical experiences, are basically delusional, and they're either a symptom of your kind of credulity and stupidity or a symptom of brain illness. There's been there was a kind of a century-long pathologization of these of that type of experience. But I was interested in following in the footsteps of like the great psychologist William James, and arguing that often mystical or ecstatic experiences, including like trips, can be healing for people and can be meaningful and life enhancing, and good for people. But as I was researching that book, I was aware that there are moments, there is a kind of subset of mystical or spiritual experiences which are difficult and involve alterations of yourself and alterations of your reality that last for an extended time, as in for kind of weeks and months, or in rare occasions even for years. In other words, there's a kind of, you got this dichotomy of views of mystical experiences or trips. Either the kind of pathologized view that these kinds of experiences are always bad and unhealthy and pathological, or the view you get in New Age culture or in ecstatic Christianity or in psychedelic culture, which is these kinds of experiences are basically mainly good. And so there's that dichotomy, but there is a messy middle where these kinds of experiences can be both interesting and spiritual and beautiful and life enhancing, but also terrifying. People are going beyond their ordinary ego, and it can take a bit of time to come back to consensual reality. So I wrote about that a little bit in The Art of Losing Control, and I mentioned a bit of research, but in psychology, the term that has been used for that kind of spiritual experience, which is still messy and frightening, is spiritual emergency, which was a term that was coined by Stanislav Grof, the transpersonal psychologist, and his wife Christina, in I believe the late 80s. I believe they published an anthology of essays on that topic in 1989, so quite recently, and there hasn't been a great deal written about it. So then what happened is that book came out in 2017. I then went off to the Amazon jungle to do an ayahuasca retreat. I'd become my interest in psychedelics had been renewed by my research into things like psychedelic therapy for The Art of Losing Control. So I went off to do this 10-day retreat at the Temple of the Way of Light in Iquitos in Peru, which was an amazing retreat. But in the days afterwards, I suppose I had a spiritual emergency. I'd left the retreat center. I was traveling on my own. I kind of went from Peru to the Galapagos Islands off the coast of Ecuador. And on that journey, I guess I was still very high from all the ayahuasca I'd been drinking. Mm-hmm. And I suppose it brought up some trauma from, when I was 18 in my subconscious. But I got into a very dissociated state where I wasn't sure what I felt like I was in an alternate reality, and I wasn't sure what reality I was in. And I obviously lacked the ability to kind of reality test or to critically think at that time, because I came to the conclusion that either I was in a dream or I was in some kind of afterlife. And these seemed the most likely, theories to me. And that lasted for a few days. And, friends who I was, in contact with said, look, I think you better come back to England. You don't sound, well. So I then had to take all these flights back. I had to take 3 flights back from the Galapagos Islands to London, all the time thinking I was in a dream and that I was constructing reality through my own mind. I got a plane from Ecuador to Holland, and I thought, well, if this is just my dream, why don't I upgrade to first class? So I got up from my seat and walked into first class and just upgraded. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, then later got billed for it. It turned out it wasn't a dream. But I wasn't freaking out, but I did genuinely think I was in a reality of my own construction. And then finally I got back to London, and my friend met me at the airport. And it was a bit like that scene from Inception, if you've ever seen that film, at the end of Inception, where, Leonardo DiCaprio comes into the airport and he sees his family, and he doesn't know if it's a dream or not, but he decides to just go with it. So it was like that. I saw my friend at the airport and I thought, well, is this real? I don't know, but I'm going to go with it. And as soon as I was back with my friends, I started to kind of come back to this reality and to accept that it was real. And, my friends, he surrounded me with love and hugged me. And then I would still get moments where I thought, oh, I don't know if this is real. Like, they would have to help me cross the roads because I wasn't sure if the cars were real. But after about a week, it passed, and I had completely come back to this reality. And I was lucky because my friends also had some familiarity with the idea of spiritual emergencies. And so they were able to kind of take care of me and support me without thinking, oh my God, Jules has gone completely psychotic and isn't coming back. Because obviously that would have freaked me out even more. So they were able to give me this kind of calm love and support and keep me safe while I was in this very altered state of consciousness. And then after like a week or so, I was basically completely back in this reality. But obviously that piqued my interest in spiritual emergencies even more. And so a few months later, I organized an event on that topic, and at which 3 friends of mine talked about their own spiritual emergencies. I had, I suppose, synchronicitously met several other people who'd had that kind of experience. They spoke about their spiritual emergencies, what they were like and what helped them through. And then also someone called Tim Reed spoke from a psychiatric perspective. Tim Reed is the consultant psychiatrist at Imperial College's psychedelics lab. And he's also a consultant psychiatrist at a retreat center called Synthesis, which does mushroom retreats in Holland. And he's basically quite unique in that he's a senior psychiatrist with a lot of clinical experience, but he's also very open to spiritual experiences and transpersonal psychology. So that event was fascinating, and it felt like we were covering ground that isn't sufficiently covered. And after it, we thought, well, shall we do a book about this and gather some stories, some people's stories together? In other words, to just find out what were these experiences like for people, and essentially, crucially, like what helps people through these experiences. What kind of self-care or mutual aid practices help people through these experiences so that they're not, the end of their normal life, but kind of just rather like liminal transition phases, and then they can go back to, not go back to their life, but still have flourishing lives after them. So Tim and I decided to work on this project together. Because Tim had a publishing house called Muswell Hill Press, which then actually got bought by another company called Eon Press. And we basically put out, I wrote some articles about spiritual emergencies, and we put out a call and said, have you had an experience like this? If so, get in touch. And we got like 20 or so people contacting us, of whom we selected 14 stories to try and get a range of voices and types of experience, and then they wrote their stories, and we asked them. We took, as editors, an agnostic position. We did not try to say these experiences all point to a certain spiritual reality. Rather, we were interested. People in the book made sense of their experiences in different ways. Some were, for example, Christian, some were Buddhist, some were agnostic, but we were interested in what were these experiences like, what do you think caused them, and what helped you through. So it was quite pragmatic in its approach.
Yeah, wow. There's just a little side note. There's a nice overlap here where the co-founder of High Existence, Martin Scherp, is actually the CEO and founder of Synthesis, which Tim Reed consults for. So that's a nice little overlap.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Yes, I saw Tim at Breaking Convention talking to the Synthesis stand there. Yeah, and I guess what's been interesting is I am interested in to what extent the idea of spiritual emergencies is out there in psychedelic culture, and New Age spirituality. To what extent people are familiar with it, because certainly, like, I just in my own social life and in my own writing, I come across quite a few people who've had experiences like this. Either triggered by maybe when they were on a meditation retreat, and they got into difficult territory, or they had a trip and got into difficult territory afterwards, or sometimes just spontaneously. But it's not talked about much in the culture, or I get the sense it's not talked about that much in psychedelic culture.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that this book brought up for me is what would happen if someone didn't have the support that they needed. How bad could things get? Because I heard of a friend of mine from a few years ago, and he was very much into self-improvement, trauma healing, and was starting to get into spirituality. And I know that he smoked a bit of weed, and then out of the blue, I heard that he'd killed himself. And this was like a huge shock to me. And
yeah,
and it just got me thinking, are there people who are really suffering and, are being diagnosed as psychotic and sort of judged by their friends and family that really just need to be like supported in the way that you kind of recommend in this book? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think one of the interesting questions that comes up from this topic is, to what extent can you delineate certain experiences of psychosis and say these are spiritual emergencies which should be treated in this way, and they're different from other types of psychosis? And certainly that's what the Groffs argued. They said there are clinical problems which require like long-term medication, and that's like ordinary psychosis. But there are also these types of experience called spiritual emergencies, which are like messy developmental transitions, and they are not like the rest of psychotic experiences, and they should be treated differently. But I'm not sure if one can draw a clean line between spiritual emergency and other types of psychosis. It seems to me that often spiritual emergencies involve some form of temporary psychosis, but also often I've got friends who have just psychosis, and it often involves aspects of spirituality as well. Like, in other words, to them often their experience, their psychotic experience does have spiritual aspects to it. So I don't think there's a clear line, but in a way I think the kind of self-care and mutual aid practices that help people with spiritual emergencies, the same kind of things help people just going through psychosis. So you can learn certain practices, like, for example, self-compassion. So just practicing being kind to yourself, being supportive to yourself, that works for people in spiritual emergencies, and it also works for people who just hear voices, for example, regularly all their life. Likewise, one of the things that really helps people who are experiencing spiritual emergencies is just finding a kind of frame of meaning and growth for their experience. So rather than just seeing all these, let's say they're having all these difficult thoughts and experiences, and it's terrifying, can they find a frame where they think, this isn't just a breakdown, that this is potentially something meaningful that I can navigate and grow through. And that's crucial, being able to find some kind of frame, a constructive frame within which to see that experience. And it's the same with people who have psychotic experiences. There's been research that's found that psychotic-like experiences are actually quite common in the population. Some surveys suggest maybe as many as 10% of the population just naturally have occasional psychotic-like experiences. And whether those experiences are completely disabling and ruinous to their life, or just something that happens to them, depends on whether they find a kind of meaningful frame for those experiences, and also whether they find a supportive community to help them kind of make sense of their experiences. So you see what I'm saying? There's kind of we don't need to draw a clean line between them. I think when you think of you think about the psychedelic community and the kind of skills that one needs to be a psychedelic, to be a sitter in like psychedelic ceremonies and so on. Mm-hmm. Or to volunteer at a place like the Zendo Project. Do you know what? One of these kinds of places that provides support for people having difficult trips at festivals. Mm-hmm. The kind of skills you need for that are like kindness, non-judgmentalism, non-reactivity, mindfulness, and just kind of empathetic support. And it's the same in a psychiatric ward, or it's the same if someone's going through temporary psychosis. You need exactly the same skills.
Yeah, so what comes up for me there is awareness and compassion. Like those two in combination are really, I think you said on our last podcast that if you're not becoming more kind and more humble in your spiritual pursuits, then you're kind of just watching a movie if you're taking psychedelics for some other reason. That was a paraphrase, but I really like that idea that we're trying to cultivate these virtues anyway. So of course they are helpful to other people going through a spiritual emergency and ourselves. I wanted to bring something up that you mentioned earlier about this dichotomy between some people, think that anything related to psychedelics is amazing. Any kind of bad trip is doing you really good. You've just got to kind of get through it and find the meaning. And then there's this other side that kind of judges the psychedelic movement. But you said that you had an LSD experience when you were younger that actually caused you some trauma or some sort of issues after it. And then that kind of circled back with your spiritual emergency in Peru. I was wondering if you could just go into that a little bit. I
had a couple of bad trips when I was 18, and they were similar. They were both on LSD, and in both of them I felt very kind of blocked and unable to communicate to others. And then I felt very self-conscious about that, and I felt kind of shame and paranoia, and a bit kind of frozen in fear about being unable to kind of communicate with others. So in some ways I would say that kind of LSD exposed certain frailties in my psyche, which was very geared towards social performance and extroversion and social approval, and the LSD rather exposed that as a rather fragile, psychic economy. So I had a couple of really scary bad trips where I had like serious paranoia and social anxiety, and I dealt with it not very well in retrospect, in the sense of I didn't talk to anyone about it. I just, this was in '95, and it was just a different culture, and there was much less awareness about mental illness or mental health, and I just kind of shut it down, and I think then the trauma from that experience then developed into the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder and social anxiety within a year or two, while I was at university, and that lasted for a good few years of just kind of gradually getting worse, and me getting more and more afraid and kind of lost in myself as I tried to figure out how to get better. And it took a long time to get better. And I mean, I was lucky because as I think we probably discussed last time, I had a sort of near-death experience about 4 or 5 years after, which helped me to recover. And then cognitive behavioral therapy and Stoicism helped me after that. But it was a long old time. It took a long time to get better. And when I see people like I've seen research saying only a vanishingly small number of people ever have long-term difficulties after psychedelics, I think, well, either I was really, really, really unlucky, or that's not true. And my sense from conversations with other people is that it's not true, and that other people also have longer term problems emerging from difficult psychedelic experiences. In terms of how that relates, I mean, that was why I didn't then do psychedelics for 20 years, because I was putting myself back together and building up kind of resilience. And I only did psychedelics again when I turned 40, because I felt I'd built up kind of a strong inner core of self-care, and B, I was doing it in a kind of guided therapeutic context where there were therapists present, because I thought I might, the old trauma might well come back up. And I did feel kind of helped and guided on the ayahuasca retreats I went on. What I didn't expect was that the trauma would come back up after the retreat, not during it when there are therapists there, but after it when I was traveling on my own. And I remember looking up on the Temple of Way of Light's website, and it talked about integration. And it said some people can have difficulties arising from ayahuasca for weeks, months, or years. And I was like, years? This could last for years? And luckily for me, it did only last for weeks. But it's interesting because it raises questions about spiritual retreat centers. Needs, what kind of resources can they provide for people who might get into difficulties for weeks or months or years afterwards? So the Temple of Way of Light didn't provide much in the way of resources. I think I could have a Zoom chat with a kind of an online therapist who told me to eat lots of starchy foods. This is what I thought I was in the afterlife. So I think it's important that retreat centers, not just psychedelic retreat centers, but meditation centers, Vipassana centers, and so on, churches, have an awareness of these kinds of experiences. Because all of the contributors in the book, well, not all of them, but several of them, talked about trying to make sense of their experience when they were in the midst of the crisis and reaching out to either spiritual leaders or to psychiatrists, and often just finding that these people had no sense of what they were going through, no familiarity of the terrain. And when you're in a spiritual emergency, you're extremely raw and sensitive. And so you're very sensitive when people kind of label you or judge you or don't really get where you're coming from. So for that reason, I think it's important that both faith communities and psychedelic and new age centers and communities have a familiarity with this terrain and how to help people through it. Because often they just wash their hands of people. If you get in trouble on a Vipassana retreat and go psychotic, or somewhere like Landmark Forum, for example, they just wash your hands of you and say, well, sorry, not your problem, you're on your own now. So then you have to go to a secular psychiatrist who says, oh yes, you've got bipolar disorder, or you've got schizophrenia.
Yeah, that was a common theme from some of the stories that seemed to be very positive, is when they were able to connect with people who knew what they were going through or who had experiences like that. And I know that in your account you were texting a friend who also wrote an entry, and she was able to kind of feel into your texts and to kind of guide you back home, which I thought was beautiful.
Yeah.
When I read your account in Breaking Open, it gave me the lesson that if I were to plan a medicine retreat, I should be very careful about also planning what I do after the retreat, and perhaps not spend extended periods alone, where it's just me and my mind, because I did get a sense of loneliness when I read what you were up to after the retreat. I mean, exactly. I thought I was being sensible because I thought I'd go off and be in nature, and when am I next going to be in Peru and close to the Galapagos Islands? So I thought, what could be better than being in the Galapagos Islands to integrate afterwards? But you're absolutely right. I think being in nature is great, but it's really helpful to be around friends and loved ones. Because I guess I realized that how we make sense of reality is so much connected to our hearts and our emotions, and when we feel in touch with other people, literally in touch and able to kind of hug them, that's when we get a bit more grounded in this reality. So for me, and I think it was true of several people in this story, in the book, their spiritual emergency was it was a moment of transcendence, and a transcendence of ordinary reality, and a transcendence from their ordinary sense of selves, and sometimes from their bodies as well. So several people in the book talk about feeling like material reality had dissolved, and in some ways they gain this kind of mystic insight that everything is fluid, everything is connected, there are no separate things. But that's scary if you're not prepared for it, if you're not expecting that mystical experience of oneness. Can I read you a little passage from one of the contributors? Oh yeah, please.
Because it's a beautiful account of that kind of moment of sorry. Okay. So this is by one of the contributors called Deborah Martin, and she went to a club in Scotland, in Glasgow, and took MDMA, and she felt she shifted into a weird headspace in the club, and it lasted all night, and she got quite freaked out and went home with her boyfriend and went to bed, and then she writes, "The morning after the club, I woke to a world that looked entirely different. Everything in the room, the clothes, the walls, the chest of drawers, seemed strangely insubstantial, as if woven from air, as if I could huff and puff like the wolf in the storybook and blow it all down. It didn't go away, although I willed it to. Otherness, the otherness of objects, the otherness of people, was just an illusion, at least that's how it seemed. Yet I wanted those illusions back, as I suddenly understood their necessity. I was tortured by the fear that this perceptual shift was somehow going to result in the entire world disappearing in front of my eyes, as if now that I'd seen how flimsy the fabric of reality was, it could suddenly be pulled away like a stage curtain to reveal nothing but a void. So it's like, that's an experience of like Maya. You know, you go through the illusion of separateness and see that everything's connected, but that's scary if you're not prepared for it. And then you have to go back to your ordinary life and your ordinary job on Monday morning. So what helped people through that experience is to try and become grounded back in this material reality. And that means coming to your senses, coming back to your body. So for me, I remember the thing I loved most after I was getting grounded after my ayahuasca experience was like sitting by the fire with my brother's dog next to me and just stroking the dog. And that was just, it was such a material experience. And or like gardening, you know, just feeling the earth between your hands, or like I think Jack Cornfield talks about a guy who had a spiritual emergency on a meditation retreat, and he was told, okay, don't sit and meditate anymore. That's the last thing you need, is to kind of be in your head. Just go for some jogs, get back into your body, get some of just get rid of some of this nervous energy. And likewise, hugs from friends were super important to me as well. That kind of touch was grounding. And obviously we're all in a lockdown at the moment, so we're all suffering from a touch deficit, which is weird, and I think must be very tough for people if they have temporary, if they're prone to occasional psychosis, because we're all in a dissociated state at the moment. But finding ways to get back in touch with our bodies and this material reality, and to get grounded, that is super helpful for people. The other thing I would say that is often helpful for people, going back to a point you made earlier, is somehow not taking yourself too seriously, and not taking your experience too seriously. So not giving way to spiritual inflation, because a spiritual experience is a kind of sense that an encounter with the divine, or what I mean, or kind of cosmic consciousness or something, or a sense of connection to the all, and that can sometimes be taken over literally as the idea that you are God, or that you are constructing reality, which is certainly what I felt. I thought, this is all a dream. This is all my dream. You get a sense of how our thoughts construct reality, but you can then think, oh, reality is nothing but my thoughts, which you see kind of fall into solipsism there and into narcissism. So that can be a risk on spiritual experiences and on trips. Ram Dass calls it the Trap of Specialness. You think, I've had this extraordinary cosmic experience and I'm special. This marks me out from other people. Perhaps I have some kind of grand cosmic role to fulfill. Perhaps we're in the apocalypse and I have some kind of apocalyptic mission to fulfill. It can be quite easy, because that's in a bit, the subconscious does often think in that rather grand cosmic way. So it can be easy to fall into that mythological type of thinking and to take it literally. And that's dangerous for all kinds of reasons. But one of the dangers is, as soon as you start thinking you're the kind of cosmic messiah, that can easily flip into paranoia and persecution. If you're special chosen one of the cosmos, then maybe people are out to get you. And so do you see what I mean? It can flip into paranoia and persecution. And the antidote for that is just to not to remind yourself that yes, you're a spark of the divine, but so is everyone else. And it, you know, in a way, this is nothing special. This is just this is the kind of experience that's happened to thousands and millions of other people. And that's not to denigrate it. It's a kind of beautiful, mysterious, awesome experience, but it's also normal in a way. And to try and come back down to earth. And, you know, humor, it reminds me of the word, you know, humility as well, of just like not taking it too seriously, if that's possible.
What I loved from many of the stories was there seemed to be a lot of resonance with the types of enlightenment stories that I've read about Buddhism and people who've meditated a lot. And I know that in many traditions of Buddhism, they focus a lot on building stability of attention first and loving kindness first before you start dealing with the more deep insights later on. And it sounded like a lot of the people in spiritual emergency situations were getting downloads of insights, but didn't have like a strong enough container to be able to kind of deal with it, you know?
I think that's right. Yeah. I think they had kind of slightly fragmented ego boundaries. I mean, so we were interested in, you know, what are the commonalities in their stories in terms of what makes someone prone to a spiritual emergency. And Tim and I noticed that one of the commonalities in the story is quite a few of the people, the contributors, had early trauma of some sort, which may have made them more prone to have slightly fragmented ego boundaries, which both makes them more prone to ecstatic experiences. If you have, you know, slightly fragmented ego boundaries, it's in some ways easier to go beyond the ego, but it also makes them more prone to get into difficulties because trauma can come up from the past. So that was, you know, it seems that early trauma makes you more prone to have a spiritual emergency. So I think you should be aware of that if you're going on a retreat or taking psychedelics. But yeah, no, I think you're right. Maturity helps one to integrate these kinds of experiences. One of the stories in the book is someone called John Ablett, and he has a kind of mini enlightenment experience when he's at university. A sudden see-through of consensual reality and a transcendent experience, and he is filled with energy, and he feels he's in a kind of altered special state, and he feels filled with spiritual wisdom and gnosis, you know, direct knowledge, and he decides that he has become enlightened in a kind of Eckhart Tolle way. And he becomes he starts teaching and giving talks, and he becomes known as the Barefoot Guru, because he walks around barefoot. He's just sleeping on friends' sofas, just giving teachings, and lots of people gather to listen to him and look to him for wisdom. And for a few weeks and months, he becomes this guru figure. And then at a certain point, while he's giving these teachings, he thinks, this doesn't feel right. He kind of comes down a bit and feels like he's maybe playing a role, or, you know, that what was initially maybe a real high wears off. And then he starts to feel he's just playing this role. And he has to step down from the guru role and say, yeah, I'm sorry, and go back to his life. And that takes real courage and maturity, where you've had a spiritual insight and you put yourself forward as an enlightened guru, and then you say, actually, I don't think I am enlightened. I've come down. Do you know that I really like that story in a way, because I think that must happen to people a lot, right? To gurus, that they have some genuine moment of enlightenment, but then they haven't become fully enlightened, and everyone looks to them as the all-knowing godlike figure. And what was originally vital and real becomes hardened into a kind of role, and then probably quite easily into a power trip and a control trip. So it's just that story impresses me, as his ability to walk away from that role.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder how many people haven't walked away from that role, and what happened as a consequence. So yeah, I really like that story, and I also respected him when he said that going back home was the most difficult thing he's ever done, because of all the relationships that had been damaged after his experience. Yeah, it's an incredible story. I wanted to ask you about so psychotherapy, I think, has got a bit of a stigma still, unfortunately. A lot of people obviously want to become more whole, want to heal. We go on retreats, we read books, but I actually don't know that many people who seek out psychotherapy. I don't know many people, and it's kind of strange, right? Like, why would we want to spend thousands going on retreats to heal ourselves and then not want to have a few sessions of psychotherapy? I know that you worked with a psychotherapist for, was it a psychedelic integration specialist after your spiritual emergency? I was just wondering how useful this was, and would you recommend people seek out therapy like this?
Great question. So I had tried therapy before, but I had never really stuck to it, because I never really got on with a therapist, and always felt that they were just, pushing forward their certain theory. And I, maybe I knew better or something. But again, my friend Louisa, Louisa Tomlinson, who's a poet and another contributor in the book. She was the person who met me at the airport and kind of talked me back from the Galapagos Islands. And, she's one of my oldest friends. So I was very lucky to have her as a friend and support. And she's like a, energy healer. So she's quite comfortable in these waters, she's, anyway, she suggested to me this psychedelic integration expert based in Brighton, where Louisa lives, called Maria Papaspiru. So Maria and I started to have Skype sessions where basically to help me integrate this messy ayahuasca experience. And I found them extremely helpful. And particularly in the kind of 2 months after the experience, because my psyche was still quite open and fluid. And I feel she really helped me to learn things about myself in that fluid, open 2 months afterwards. But then, and then we continued the session. So I would say the work became a bit slower, because your kind of psyche hardens back a bit like molten lava into more of a, fixed state. But we're still going. To my surprise, I thought I would stop after a year, but it'll be 2 years in October. No, it'll be 3 years in October. God. So we still do these weekly Skype sessions, and we've only met once, which was when we were both talking at the Breaking Open convention. But she's just been fantastically helpful, and that's the only time I've ever done therapy, and I just think it's very useful. I think particularly if one has attachment issues, in terms of interpersonal issues, how you relate to others, and I think those kinds of issues are not easy to heal on your own with self-help, and they're not easy to heal. They're certainly not easy to heal on a kind of silent retreat, because you're just sitting there on your own. And they're not even easy to heal on just a kind of, let's say a kind of tantra week, because you're meeting strangers. They're healed through relationships, because in that long relationship, you will get the old triggers will come up and your defenses will come up, and I find that in therapy you can learn to see when your automatic defense systems just come up like a security wall, if you can imagine, just slamming down, and you can learn to disable those automatic defense systems so that they don't just slam down. So I find that that's been really helpful for me in therapy. And I don't think that's easy to do on. In fact, I know that you can't do that on your own, and you can't just do that on an occasional retreat, or you know what I mean, or a kind of weekend Tony Robbins seminar. It's which is still, you can get other things from those kinds of things, I reckon, but it's only in a kind of long-term relationship can one see one's automatic triggers and defenses and gradually work to kind of, when you get triggered, just to stay with it rather than to run off or to push someone away. I mean, that doesn't mean it has to be through therapy, of course. Some people might get that through a romantic relationship or through a friendship. I think it's quite good to do it with someone who's trained to work with you. So I would also say that Maria works. She helps to run something called the TRIP network, TRIPP, which is a network of psychotherapists trained in psychedelic integration. I believe that network is mainly in the UK, but in other places you have the International Spiritual Emergence Network. So that also has some therapists who are trained in the idea of spiritual emergencies. And then you have the Spiritual Crisis Network. So there are these kinds of networks and resources out there for people. And there are also psychedelic integration circles, which exist in several cities around the world. I mean, and those are kind of groups where you can check in with people, particularly after difficult trips. Sometimes they're free, sometimes you pay a little bit, but they're group formats, and you can just share stories, support each other. And again, that's very helpful to come back from the kind of liminal world of altered states and to come back into a more of a consensual reality. So it's partly about constructing that bridge between what you could call the spirit world or the world of altered states and the ordinary world, the mundane world. So both therapists can be helpful for that, and groups like spiritual crisis groups, and also books as well. I mean, like several of our contributors say, finding books that talk about this kind of experience can be helpful as a bridge, whether that's books by like Carl Jung, who definitely had a massive spiritual emergency himself, lasting a couple of years, I think, or books by Stanislav Grof, Tim Reed, or Breaking Open. So that Pema Chodron, she's a great Tibetan nun who had panic attacks for years, and used these panic attacks as a kind of catalyst for practicing compassion and mindfulness. And she writes about that in a book called When Things Fall Apart, which her teachings were super helpful to me, by the way, on my spiritual emergency. I found right after the ayahuasca experience, I couldn't understand books and I could barely understand conversation. For some reason, my ordinary cognitive faculties were disabled. I tried to read Dune and I couldn't understand it. Then I tried to read Tintin, couldn't understand it. But I could always understand Pema Chodron for some reason. Like, even when I was in this totally altered state, her teachings were really clear to me and really made sense. And just this Buddhist idea of like, this will pass. Breathe, accept the anxiety, and remind yourself this will pass. That was very helpful to me when I was in a very altered state and I didn't know what was real. I could still like practice that basic practice. So you can find books and guides that are helpful too. But yeah, just to go back to your point, yeah, I'm really surprised by that therapy is not common among your friends who are probably like, spiritual seekers. Yeah, I think, sometimes that, because it's like shoveling shit, isn't it? And it's more exciting to go off for a razzle dazzle light experience and a kind of epic DMT encounter, rather than just talking about your difficult relationship with your father, say, because that's more like shoveling shit. But you've got to do both, I think.
Yeah, and I've also observed a sort of like a lot of motivational speakers. I've kind of been anti-therapy over the years, because obviously a lot of motivational speakers don't have formal training, and they want to kind of offer quick, fast, immediate results. And I've just picked up across the years sort of slating trained psychotherapists in various talks and stuff, which I don't think is helpful.
Well, I mean, it's certainly like, it took me several therapists before I found one that I liked. So it may well be that, I mean, and there are bad therapists out there. So word of mouth is good, but what I love about this therapist that I'm with now is that she does not impose really her own model of reality. She's a great listener. She's very empathetic, and she's intuitive as well. And what turned me off previous psychotherapists was I just felt that they had one just kind of tick box model, which they wanted to kind of fit my experience into. So it can take a while. It may be that the first therapist you see is not the right therapist for you. The most important thing they found in whether a therapy works is not necessarily the type of therapy they offer. Most important is the empathetic bond. Do you like each other? Do you get on? Do you trust the person and feel they have your back? That's the most important thing.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. This is very useful for me as well. And I'm definitely going to check out the Trip network. I'm super fascinated to learn more about psychedelic integration. A lot of the sort of psychedelic facilitators that I know have incredible skills just in conversation and just in holding space that can be used outside of a psychedelic space, which I think is really inspirational.
For sure.
So that's why I'm really fascinated to learn more. And I think the book you mentioned by Pema was The Places That Scare You in Breaking Open.
By Pema Chodron. The Places That Scare You. And then she wrote another one called When Things Fall Apart. But some of these just basic wisdom practices from Buddhism, from Stoicism, from Christianity are definitely, they still work when you're in liminal spaces, which is really interesting to me. The Stoic idea of focus on what you can control, accept what you can't, or the Buddhist idea of just using your breath to calm yourself down, or reminding yourself that things will pass. That to me is encouraging, that maybe these practices still work after death, which is what the Tibetan Book of the Dead teaches, that you can kind of train yourself for that transition as well, and then use these kinds of skills to navigate that. I mean, in a way, because spiritual emergencies are moments of ego dissolution. They're just kind of quite difficult, scary phases of ego dissolution. But I suppose death is in a way the big ego dissolution. So possibly these kinds of experiences, maybe they help us in that experience as well. And it's also interesting to think about what's the relevance of these kinds of experiences to society today. What can spiritual emergencies tell us, if we haven't had one of these types of experiences? And I think, in a way, one could argue that we're going through something of a kind of collective spiritual emergency at the moment in terms of our habitual sense of reality has broken down. The kind of executive functioning of our governments has to some extent broken down. Habitual institutions that we've taken for granted, like neoliberal capitalism and so on, are no longer taken for granted. And we are in a liminal space at the moment where there's all kinds of possibilities, all kinds of possible futures. And you see this flooding, this rising of subliminal and archetypal content into consciousness. You're seeing mythical thinking. You're seeing the sudden spread of conspiracy theories, of this kind of magical thinking going mainstream. So this all suggests to me that we, as a species and as a culture, have gone into this kind of liminal, mythical underworld state, and so I think these stories are helpful in terms of giving us practices to cope with this liminal space, this kind of underworld space, practices of bringing your attention back to the present moment, of grounding yourself back in the body, of non-judgmentalism, non-reactivity. And I suppose there's also the question of, do these experiences tell us anything about reality, about the nature of reality? And it's a similar question you could ask about trips as well. Are they just fun movies, or are they telling us anything about the actual nature of reality? And we're careful not to draw too dogmatic conclusions from this book, because it's basically it's a self-help, a mutual aid book for people going through these experiences. But they do seem to point to the idea that ordinary reality is constructed, is just a habitual construction. And that habitual construction, can be taken for granted, but there are moments when we see through it. And that perhaps behind that construction, there is much more of an interconnected reality. And perhaps, our individual consciousness are actually more connected than we usually think. So I think in a way, these kinds of experiences are maybe pointing to that more interconnected nature of reality. Yeah,
I found that when I was reading the book, that even though some of the stories were difficult experiences or challenging experiences, they did kind of point to something optimistic as well, like this kind of beauty of consciousness or reality. And I think that the message that I took is, this is powerful stuff. The mind is a very powerful thing. Psychedelics is a very powerful tool, and we do need to have the structures in place to do it safely, and support networks and information, like in Breaking Open and anything related to spiritual emergencies, so that we can sort of tilt it slightly more in the direction of interconnectedness and peace and tranquility, and try to kind of like steer ourselves through the hardships that might arise if we're not fully prepared for it. So
that's right. I mean, what we've had arise since the 60s is a kind of mass mysticism, where the number of people reporting mystical experiences has gone from 20% in 1960, according to Gallup, to around 50% 10 years ago. And I'm sure it's even more now in the psychedelic renaissance. So experiences which used to be, relatively rare, and now it appears becoming more common. But we as ordinary people outside of monastic traditions have not necessarily the training and the map for these kinds of mind-blowing experiences. If we're, spiritual but not religious, we don't necessarily have the community support either, or the elders to guide us. So we are having to learn for ourselves as a culture. And I suppose this book is just part of that. Is part of our culture evolving better understanding of these kinds of experiences and trying to share them in a non-hierarchical way. Like, these are just people saying, this is what worked for me.
Yeah. Wow. Well, I think what we've covered here has been very useful to me. As I said, I'm going to be recommending Breaking Open to pretty much everyone that I know who reads.
Great.
Thanks, what are you? We're obviously in a strange time right now. So
yeah.
I mean, what are you up to? You know, what are your projects at the moment? Are you sort of in limbo, or are you still doing stuff?
I'm finding lockdown quite fruitful creatively. So I've been working on a book, and I've written about half of it so far. And it started off as a book about Aldous Huxley and his friends, who were known as the mystical expats. They included Gerald Hurd, who was the guy who introduced psychedelics to Silicon Valley in the 50s, and Alan Watts, who I guess your listeners will have heard of, and a novelist called Christopher Isherwood. And these four Brits all moved to California in the 30s, and then helped to invent the counterculture. So I've been researching them for a couple of years, and particularly Aldous Huxley, and doing some talks about Huxley, which have been really well received. There's a huge amount of interest in Aldous Huxley. He was the guy who wrote The Doors of Perception and Brave New World. But what's happened this year is I've been researching not just Aldous, but his family as well, including his brother, who was someone called Sir Julian Huxley, who developed a form of kind of evolutionary spirituality. And Julian Huxley was not, he was a kind of leading biologist. He was also a eugenicist, as was Aldous Huxley. So they believed in eugenics, which is the idea that humans can intervene in our evolution to encourage the fittest to breed more and the less fit to breed less, right? So it's quite a kind of a dark political movement, which was obviously very popular with the Nazis, but and there's a kind of revival of eugenics at the moment with the kind of genetic revolution. So the idea that we can identify the genes that make you intelligent and then genetically engineer genius babies or so on. So what I've ended up looking at is partly the story of the Huxleys and how they helped to invent kind of new age culture and spiritual but not religious culture, for which I'm very thankful, and that's my culture. But also at this dark side of some new age culture, which is a tendency to spiritual elitism, to think that you are a kind of special group or even a kind of new species of humanity. So for the last 100 years in New Age culture, there have been people saying that a new super species, like what Yuval Harari calls Homo Deus, is emerging and evolving. And that obviously we, people like us, are obviously part of this new super being species. And we are evolving, and then there are some people who are kind of regressive or degenerative, and they should somehow be, they will either pass away or perhaps they should be encouraged to pass away. So there's the dark side to New Age spirituality. And so I've just been exploring that. And that's not really where I expected this book to go, but it's kind of the trail I'm following at the moment. So I would say if you or any of your listeners, if that rings any bells in terms of avenues I should research or people I should talk to, they should get in touch with me, because I'm enjoying kind of, following the trail of that story, and people are helping me with it. So I interviewed Rupert Sheldrake about it last week just for YouTube, and I'm interviewing Douglas Rushkoff next week, who's done some writing about it. So it's a pretty interesting topic to me.
So my first feelings that came up when you were explaining that was like, this sounds amazing. Like, it feels very relevant.
Yeah.
And it's one of those things that when you said that, it's like I recognize that as being true, but I hadn't really thought of it like that before.
Nor had I
you know?
at all. Yeah. It was
So-
only the connection between Aldous and his brother Julian that made me think about this connection between Aldous' like human potential movement and Julian's eugenics. And I just recognized that actually there's often a real connection between the idea that on the one hand, there are these super beings who have completely fulfilled their human potential, and then there are what Nietzsche called subhumans. So it's very Nietzschean. There's the supermen and the submen. And yeah, it's just nasty elitism and authoritarianism. And I think there have long been, within Western esotericism, for centuries, there's been people who thought they are part of the elite. They are above the masses, and they have this special occult knowledge, and it falls to them to kind of control the masses and steer humanity to a kind of glorious future. And what's interesting to me is the kind of paranoid conspiracies that we see a lot at the moment during the pandemic. You know, what do they say? They say there's a secret global elite who are trying to control the masses and lower the kind of global population, and they're actually eugenicists, and maybe they're not even the same species as us. And what I'm realizing in my research is that there's kind of then that's not totally bonkers. They're kind of right, but they just slightly misinterpret it because they think of it as a kind of satanic Luciferian plot. But they are right that there has always been this kind of elitists who think that they're spiritually superior, and it falls to them to control the human race. And often that elite has had exalted religious visions of like one world government and of a kind of new global perennialist spirituality. They're often quite into like free love and polyamory, you know. So it's just it's a funny trip.
Wow.
Yeah, I wrote an article called "Conspirituality" about this, about why are New Age people so into conspiracy theories? Because I've really been struck by this during the pandemic. Suddenly, a lot of my New Age friends have been sharing, you know, quite out there conspiracy theories. So anyway, that's on Medium. It's called Conspirituality. That talks about some of this stuff I've been kind of thinking about.
Yeah, my teammate at High Existence, Mike Slavin, really liked that piece. I'll put a link to that in the article.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah,
Well,
awesome.
if you or your listeners have any kind of thoughts about avenues to explore, or people to interview for that topic, I found my readers have been very helpful to me. I guess I'm particularly interested in how these ideas play out in Silicon Valley today. You know, in the idea of kind of Silicon Valley transhumanism and Silicon Valley human potential. So, yeah.
Where's the best place for people to send you a comment or something like that?
Well, my email is jules@philosophyforlife.org.
Okay.
But also, if people want to if people either have struggled with spiritual emergencies or have loved ones who have, they can feel free to get in touch as well, and I can try to connect them to local resources and local people near them. So by all means, feel free to email me for that as well.
Amazing. And what if people want to just continue to look more into your work? Do you have like a YouTube channel or?
Yeah, I've got a YouTube
website?
channel which is it's just JJR Evans. That has some talks on spiritual emergencies as well.
Okay.
My website's philosophyforlife.org. And then yeah, I've written books. My first book was about how people use ancient Greek philosophy in modern life, particularly Stoicism. Then I wrote about ecstatic experiences, and now this latest book about spiritual emergencies.
Great. I'll also link to the first interview that we did, where you discussed Stoicism and the art of losing control quite in depth, and everyone I've spoken to about that really liked that conversation. So
it was really fun. It was the first time I think that I've kind of had the opportunity to talk with someone and kind of connect the different bits of my writing journey. So yes, I really appreciated that, John.
Well, great. Thank you so much for your time. And I'm super looking forward to the next book that you're working on. Hopefully we can chat about that when you feel like.
Absolutely, John. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.